Hello, hello, and welcome to Tuesday afternoon's little biology lesson. Little bit of A-level biology just to keep you going into Tuesday evening. And this evening it is the cardiac cycle as voted for on the community tab this last week. Looks like, I can't even remember what I'm supposed to be doing next week, but let's concentrate on what I'm doing this week, and that is cardiac cycle. So first of all, I am going to go through the principles that actually are fundamental to you understanding how the cardiac cycle works. And those are largely understanding how the valves work and how they're structured, and how they work with the different pressures of blood in the different chambers of the heart. We're then going to go through the three-stage cardiac cycle: cardiac diastole, atrial systole, and ventricular systole. And then we're going to go through the graph, the one that has all those lines, which is talking about the pressure changes on one side of the heart, nearly always the left side of the heart. So that's the one that we're going to go through. And hopefully in the next 20 minutes or so, we will have clarified this all for you. So you'll go away feeling a lot happier about understanding the cardiac cycle and how to describe and explain what is going on. There's the plan. So just a quick hello to all of you. Do put questions in the chat if you have questions. I am broadcasting about 10 seconds after before you're seeing it, so just be aware that there might be a little bit of delay in me seeing the question and being able to answer it. So hello to all of you. Nice to see some regulars back here. So let us get on with a little bit of context, as always. So as you all know, every single cell has to be supplied with oxygen and glucose for good old respiration. And they have to be supplied with nutrients and water and all the rest of it. But they've also got to have carbon dioxide and all other waste products removed. And this has got to happen 24/7. And that means that we need, and because we're talking humans here, or at the very least mammals, have to have some kind of circulatory system, a mass transport system that allows this circulation of the blood to happen so that all these things can be taken to the cells and all the toxins can be taken away. So hello to all of you, just saying hello to Frederick and Fatima and Aruza and Freya, sorry. Nice to see you all. So this is so that this has to happen, this cardiac cycle, which is the synchronization of the atria and the ventricle contractions. This has to happen for mass transport to occur, because there has to be a pressure gradient for mass transport. Because mass transport, by definition, is the movement of fluid in one direction through tubes, which in animals are the blood vessels, in plants it would be the xylem or the phloem, and that has to happen down a pressure gradient. So something has to produce that pressure gradient. And in humans, that is the heart pumping that produces that pressure. And just to remind you, the heart is a double pump. It's got its two pumps stuck together down that central wall, the septum, and the right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs and the left side of the heart pumps blood to the body. And just so that to remind you again, is that those two pumps which are stuck together, they do everything at the same time. When the atria contract, they both contract. When the ventricles contract, both ventricles contract. So there is a nice synchronicity down both sides of the heart. So just a quick thing, just to kind of say, do have a look at my website, www.biologycarol.co.uk, because I have got all my videos that cover the whole of AQA and the OCRA specifications for A-level. And they are, if you want the whole flipping lot for a year, you can have them for £50. They're on there. The full price is 100, but the half price code that you put in checkout is in the description. And you can get the AS ones for 25 quid. And because I am passionate about making A-level biology accessible to any student, regardless of their family income, if your family is strapped for cash, if you can pull together the money, you can earn commission on friends' purchases and potentially even make a profit on what you have bought. And there's also a freebie. So if nothing else, go and have a look and grab that. So, right, now let's get on to the principles of the cardiac cycle. First principle, the orientation of the heart valve. So here's my little reminder from the cardiac structure video and live stream that I did a little while ago, that here is the structure of the heart. We've got the atria at the top, we've got the ventricles down the bottom, and just to remind you, we've got the aorta here, the pulmonary artery here. So these two blood vessels at the top here are the arteries because they're taking the blood away from the heart, whereas the two vessels coming in, bringing the blood into the heart, are the veins. And very fortuitously, the word vein has the word in it, which is quite handy. But the bit that we're concentrating on are the valves. Here are funnily enough, the atrioventricular valves, and here are the semilunar valves. Notice that the atrioventricular valves separate the atria and the ventricles. And the semilunar valves separate the ventricles with the arteries. Useful for you to bear that in mind. So here we go. The atrioventricular valves point downwards. Their flappy ends are at the bottom. They are secured to the atrial walls at the top. So that means that they kind of, in a very simplistic diagram, they look like this. You've got the atria at the top, you've got the ventricle underneath, and they point downwards. Conversely, the semilunar valves point upwards. The untethered end is at the top. They are secured, they are joined to the wall of the arteries at the bottom. And so this, in summary, is how they could be drawn. They separate the ventricles from the arteries. Here's the really important thing, is the pressures of the blood either side of those valves. And we would say the relative pressures. Relative meaning just one thing being compared to another. This means this is one of those times when in the answers to exam questions, you have got to use the ER words. You have got to say that the pressure is higher or lower. You can't just say, oh, the pressure in the ventricles is high. I couldn't give a monkey's whether it's high or not. If it's not higher than the atrial pressure, it's not going to make the atrioventricular valves closed. It's all about the relative, comparative pressures of the blood either side of these valves. That's why you've got to get your wording right. Higher and lower are essential. So, right, here's the next thing. For me to be able to describe how these valves work, the simplest way for me to do it is to talk about the concave and convex sides of the valve. Remember that the concave side of a curve is the side that goes in, because caves go in. That's how I remember it. So here is the concave side of this line. And on the other side is the convex side. So can you see that if we're talking about the atrioventricular valves, This is the concave side of the valve, and this is the convex. Alternatively, actually, in contrast, the semilunar valves, this is the concave side, and here is the convex side. So when the blood pressure on the concave side, you could also say the pockets, if the blood pressure in the pockets of the valves, but actually examiners are going to prefer concave and convex. If the pressure on the concave side is greater than on the convex side, the valves are going to snap shut. And I deliberately use that kind of dramatic term, excuse me. They are going to snap shut. As soon as there is blood up inside these parts of the valve, they can do nothing but snap shut and close. Can you see that the same would happen with the semilunar valves if the blood pressure is pushing down on this side of the valve? They can do nothing but snap shut. I hope that makes sense. And that really helps you enormously to just understand and therefore remember how the valves work and how the relative pressures are important. So hopefully it makes sense that when the blood pressure on the concave side, is less than on the convex side, the valves open. You could, of course, say the other way around. You could say, hey, look, when the blood pressure on the convex side is greater than on the concave side, does it make sense that those valves are they're actually not going to open. They're going to just flop open. Hopefully that makes sense. Think about those semilunar valves. If the blood pressure in the ventricle is greater than the blood pressure in the artery, they are going to be squashed to the side of the arteries as the blood charges through that valve. But as soon as the blood pressure up here gets greater than down here, they are going to snap shut. So, understanding, number one, the orientation of the valves, whether they point downwards or point upwards, and then kind of understanding in your head, whether you use concave, convex, wouldn't worry too much. But then when you understand, hey, well, if the blood's on this side, it's going to snap shut. Understanding that as a principle helps an awful lot. Startup, are all my live streams on my YouTube channel? An awful lot of them are. An awful lot of them are. So I hope that helps. And I've kept all of my most popular videos, right, just so that, hopefully you can access most of what you need. I hope that's useful. So the third principle is understanding the reason for the relative pressures. And that, of course, is to do with whether these chambers, the atria and the ventricles, as to whether one or other of them is in contraction, and generally, therefore, the other one is in relaxation. And if you can imagine, if the atria are contracting, and the ventricles are relaxing, it isn't too hard to kind of get your head around the fact that the pressure in the atria might be greater than the pressure in the ventricles, and therefore the blood's just going to pour through those atrioventricular valves. They're just going to flop open. But on the other hand, if the atria are relaxed and the ventricles are contracting, hopefully it makes sense that these ventricles are going to produce a pressure that is higher than the pressure in the atria, and therefore those atrioventricular valves are going to snap shut. But while that is happening, if the ventricles are contracting, they're going to produce a pressure that is greater than in the arteries, and therefore those semilunar valves are going to be squashed to the side of the arterial walls, the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and that blood is going to whoosh out of the heart. Hopefully that makes sense. And here we have a little reminder about here we go again, the relative thicknesses of the walls of the different chambers. You can see from this diagram that the atrial wall thickness is frankly pathetic. And that atrial wall, remember, is made of muscle. But because it is the thinnest, when those atrial walls contract, they frankly produce a slightly pathetic force on the blood, because they don't need to produce very much more, because they've only got to get the blood from the atria into the ventricles. They don't need to be very thick. The right ventricle, on the other hand, is significantly thicker than the atrial walls, but it is significantly thinner than the left ventricle wall. And that's because when the right ventricle contracts, it's only pumping the blood to the neighboring lungs. Just remember that the heart is kind of sitting in between the lungs. So the right ventricle wall doesn't have to act with as much, doesn't have to provide that much force on the blood, because it's only got to move that blood down the pressure gradient by mass transport to the neighboring lungs. Here we get to the left ventricle. This is where everything happens, because of course the left ventricle is significantly thicker than the right ventricle wall. If you've done your heart dissection, I think, you can kind of look at it being at least double to 3 times the thickness. And does it make sense when that much thicker, much bigger muscle contracts, it produces a much bigger force on the blood in the ventricle. And that means that the blood from the left ventricle can leave the heart with enough force to reach the extremities of the body, because the left side of the heart has to pump the blood all the way around the body. It's got to get to the tips of my toes, to the tips of my fingers, and to the top of my head. The left ventricle has got by far the hardest work and could potentially feel very hard done by in terms of the way the work is kind of divvied up by the various chambers of the heart. Hope that makes sense. It's all about, just like your skeletal muscles, if you have got big, strong muscles, when you contract those muscles, you are going to be able to exert more force on whatever it is that you're either lifting or pulling or whatever. Okay, so it's all about, in terms of the muscle thickness of the chambers of the walls, it's about how much force they can put on the blood, and therefore how much pressure is exerted on that blood within the chamber. Okay, so here we go. And I think we've almost done this already. But when the ventricles contract, the ventricular pressure is much greater than the atrial pressure, and therefore the AV valve closes, because the blood is right up in those, behind that valve, forcing it to close. When the atria contract, on the other hand, Maria, cardiac cycle, it's going to be your favorite topic by the end of this. It is so logical. It's so logical. It's great. Come on, go for it. Right, here we go. Right, so when the atria contract, the atrial pressure, when the atria contract, the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricle pressure, because let's be honest, the ventricle they're relaxing at that point. We're going to go through this in a minute when we do the 3 stages. And therefore the AV valve opens, flops open, blood just pours through. Conversely, when the ventricles contract, now we're talking about semilunar valves here. Sorry, here, let's make this really clear. This was talking about the atrioventricular valves. Yeah. Here we're talking about the semilunar valves. When the ventricles contract, all right, the pressure in the ventricles is going to be way higher than the arterial pressure, the blood in those vessels, where the blood pressure in those vessels as the blood leaves the heart. And therefore, those semilunar valves are going to be squashed to the sides of the artery walls. They're going to be open and blood can pull through. When the ventricles are relaxed, on the other hand, remember the ventricles are relaxed, they're just having that moment, they're having that little breather before they have to contract again. The arterial pressure becomes greater than the ventricle pressure, and therefore those semilunar valves close. Okay, notice the blood, you know, it's behind that concave side of the valve, and therefore they snap shut. So now let's get on to this 3-stage cardiac cycle, and let's hopefully understand and remember those principles that I've just talked about, and therefore hopefully this will now make an awful lot more sense. There is my hope. Frederick, are the AV valves open even before the blood enters the heart? Yes, they are. I'm about to cover that right now. So yeah, so just remember, guys, this is a cycle. So we could start at any point in the cycle, and conventionally we start with cardiac diastole. Diastole means relaxation. Dia, D-I-A means expand, or expand. That's where we get diagram from. So it's kind of an expansion. Yeah, all of these diagrams, it's kind of an expansion of the real thing, if you see what I mean. The picture is an expansion to make it clearer. So diastole is kind of when, look, you can see from my diagram, both I've tried to make the atrial walls and the ventricle walls as big and rounded as I possibly can. Yes, they're as expanded as they possibly can be in this diagram to hopefully make it clear. At this point, the blood is pouring into the atria, and because the whole heart is in relaxation mode, the blood is simply pouring straight down because of gravity, nothing else. Gravity just pouring into the ventricles. And does it make sense that the blood pressure, just because of gravity, if this, you know, if the atrioventricular valves are kind of like this and there's blood kind of pouring in, they're just going to flop open. You know, let's be honest, we can say that the atrial blood pressure is greater than the ventricular blood pressure. Has to be the case for those valves to be open, but it's just because of gravity. That you can kind of say, at this point, the heart is almost filling passively. The heart's completely relaxed, you know, for the fraction of a second. It's all going to happen. So the atria and the ventricle are relaxed. And at this point, the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure, and therefore the AV valve is open. Now, just to remind you, and you'll see it when we get round the cardiac cycle, just before this relaxation, the ventricles have just done their work. They have just contracted. So can you kind of imagine, I'll emphasize this again at the end, can you imagine that actually this heart is just relaxing after just having pushed the blood out of the arteries? And therefore, with that in mind, can you kind of see that, or can you envisage that the arterial pressures are easily going to be higher than the ventricle pressure? The ventricles are relaxing. Hey, there's no pressure down there. But the arteries have just had the blood whooshing up into them. So hopefully, hopefully it makes sense to you that the arterial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure. Now, either remember that because you're remembering that the blood has just been whooshed out of those, or whooshed through those arteries, or just kind of go, hey, the ventricle's so relaxed, it's not exerting any pressure at all. Yeah, and therefore the semilunar valves are closed. And therefore, can we see that the blood is fundamentally flowing? It's flowing into the heart from the into the atria, and because of gravity, it is flowing straight down into the ventricles, flowing into the atria and straight into the ventricles. So now we go on to, hopefully it makes sense that if you remember, the first thing that has to happen is that the atria have to contract. Remember your control of a heartbeat. That whole issue with the sinoatrial node sends those electrical impulses over the atria, causing the atria to contract. Yeah, and then it does the whole AVN, bundle of His, Purkinje fibers, ventricles contract. But, you know, logically, the atria need to contract first to push that last, and it's about 20%, to push that last 20% of the blood from the atria into the ventricles so that the atria empty and the ventricles fill to their capacity. So here we've got atrial systole. This is contraction. Systole means contraction. But notice only ever one type of chamber in the heart contracts at a time. So this can often just be called atrial systole, but it's a really good idea from an examiner point of view to kind of go atrial systole and ventricular diastole, to kind of go, yeah, I know the ventricles are still relaxed here, just the atria doing their work in contracting. Try to make these atria look as small and contracting as I possibly could. So here, atrial pressure greater than the ventricle pressure, and therefore the AV valve is open, atrioventricular valve is open. And we're still in the same situation. The ventricle is still relaxed. It is not putting any pressure onto the blood in those ventricles, and therefore these semilunar valves are still closed. But the passage of blood is now very definitely from the atria, pushing that last bit of blood from the atria into the ventricles, emptying the atria and filling the ventricles. Now we come to the last stage of the cardiac cycle. We've got the blood down into the ventricles, and here is where it all happens, because the ventricles are now going to contract. Notice how I've tried to make it look as obvious as I possibly can, that these ventricle walls are now, the muscle is contracting, that the muscle length is getting shorter, and that is what exerts the force on the blood in those chambers, in the ventricles. So ventricular systole, ventricular contraction, and atrial diastole. Remember now the atria kind of go, hey, I've done my job, I'm relaxing now for a fraction of a second. And here, hopefully you kind of get when those ventricles contract, remember from the base upwards, because they've got to push the blood up out of the top of the heart. The ventricle pressure is way higher, way higher than the atrial pressure. And therefore, those atrioventricular valves, they are snapping shut. And those semilunar valves, they are being flattened to the sides of the artery walls. So AV valves closed and semilunar valves open. And the blood is now flowing. You can say it's flowing out of the heart. Yeah, it's flowing out of the ventricles into the arteries. In the left artery, the aorta, taking the blood to the rest of the body at a really high pressure. The pulmonary artery, still pretty high, has to be said. Okay, so that is the cardiac cycle. Remember that I said to you here, here, the thing that has just happened is the ventricular systole and atrial diastole, but let's focus on the ventricular systole. The blood has just been absolutely whooshed out of those two arteries at the top of the heart. So hopefully it's relatively easy for you to picture that when the heart goes into that kind of relaxed mode for a fraction of a second, the pressure in the arteries, it's not hard to imagine, is going to be greater than the pressure in the ventricles, which are also really relaxed, and therefore semilunar valves closed. I'm hoping that that now makes logical sense of why the valves, each of those valves, are open and closed at each of these phases of the cardiac cycle. And I'm hoping that it's logical and therefore much easier for you to understand. We have some questions. Are steps 1 and 2 very similar? Only, thank you, Connor, only because the state of the valves is the same. But really notice that the atria are contracting here. Yeah, just so happens that actually the state of the valves are the same. But please, I'm sure you do realise that yes, the valve status is the same, but actually what is happening in the heart is quite different, because we're going from a situation of the atria being relaxed here and the blood flowing into the ventricles passively because of gravity, and here because the atria are contracting, pushing that last bit of blood into the ventricles. The blood filling of the ventricles at this point here is not passive. It's because of the force being exerted by the atrial walls. Hope that makes sense, Connor. Arusa, you've just explained the cardiac cycle in the most beautiful way. Oh, Arusa, you're very kind. Thank you very much. How long does the cardiac cycle take? Oh, my word. This whole thing happens in roughly-ish, less than a second, about 3/4 of a second, because an average heartbeat, let's be honest, an average heartbeat of a reasonably healthy person at rest is 70, 75 beats per minute. I mean, it can range between 50 and 100, but that kind of number, and that tells you that every heartbeat takes less than a second. Like, get your heads around that. This has now taken us, 30 minutes to describe, and it's happened hundreds of times while we've been sat here. Okay, so really quickly, let's finish off on the horror that is this graph, okay? And it is going to make sense by the end of it. And I promise at the end, I will also tell you where the heart sound, the heartbeat sound, where that sound comes from, if you didn't know already. Sorry if you do. Okay, so hopefully, I wasn't going to show you that. Hopefully, I have deliberately chosen an unlabeled diagram here. These are the pressures in the ventricle, the atrium, left ventricle, notice up here, left side, the left ventricle, the left atrium, or the left artery, which is the aorta. So that we've got 3 lines here. Can we work out which is which? I'm kind of hoping we can by kind of a process of elimination. Let's go for the obvious one first. The one that does the stupidly biggest massive change. Ventricle, hopefully, left ventricle. When it contracts, the pressure goes through the flipping roof. Hopefully it's got by far the biggest pressure change from those ventricles being relaxed. to them being, or to the left one being contracted. Hopefully it makes sense that the one with the lowest pressure, the ones with the pathetically thin walls, is the atria. Yeah, the atrial pressure is this really low line, low pressure. The aorta is the dashed one, the dashed line. And that's because, remember, when the ventricle pushes the blood through, let me get this right the right way around for you guys, through the left artery, the aorta, that is under really, high pressure, which is why it's the high line. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now let's talk about where on this graph does cardiac diastole, ventricular systole, and atrial systole fit in? Well, let's do the obvious one first, I think. Here is ventricular systole. From here, where the pressure starts increasing massively, right over to just around here, this is the ventricle, the left ventricle, contracting. Okay, now logically, remember which stage of the cardiac cycle happens after ventricular systole. It's cardiac diastole. So the bit afterwards has got to be cardiac diastole, just logically. Yeah, but notice here this little hump here, dear old atria, pathetic things, pathetic. Here is where the atria is starting to contract. So here is the start of atrial systole, and here it's kind of finishing. They would have thought that, yeah, anyway, this is where it's finishing. Or it's the start, this is the start of the next atrial systole. I'm going to be honest, if this was one whole cycle, this graph should have actually started here. I hope that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. So this is atrial systole too. Okay, this is atrial systole of the next heartbeat. Here is the start of atrial systole of this first heartbeat. Hope that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, now let's have a think about those flip-in valves and what's opening and what's closing. So let's have a look at these two lines, the grey one and the solid black one. We are looking at the atrial and the ventricle pressures. Does it make sense that where these lines suddenly swap, it's where the atrioventricular valve, because remember that's about the relative pressures of the atria and the ventricle, that's when this one either opens or closes. And look at this point here, the ventricle pressure is going way higher than the atrial pressure. Ventricle pressure way higher than the atrial pressure. Here am I thinking about it. I don't learn this stuff. I learn the logic, yeah? Therefore, this must be where the atrioventricular valve closes. I flipping hope I've got it right. Oh, here am I giving you a little reminder here of the little diagrams. Yeah, good. AV valve closes. Right, process of elimination. Now I'm pretty sure I've got this right. Hopefully it makes sense that when the ventricle pressure suddenly drops below the atrial pressure, the grey line goes below the black line, this is when the AV valve opens. Atrial pressure greater than the ventricle pressure, AV valve opens. Okay, so let's have a look here. Oh, this point here is where the ventricle pressure is going above the aortic pressure. Here my ventricle pressure going above the aortic pressure. Right, this is when the semilunar valves open. Look, I'm literally showing you how I work it out in my head. I do not learn this graph ever. Semilunar valves open, all right, by process of elimination, but also totally logically at this point here, the ventricle pressure is dropping below the aortic pressure, and therefore this is when the semilunar valves close. Notice that between the times when the semilunar valves open and when they close again is the time during which the blood is leaving the left ventricle. It will also be leaving the right ventricle at the same time. Classic question to be told, as well as, oh, what times is, for what times is the blood leaving the heart, or, all that kind of stuff that you could be asked from this graph. One classic question is, oh, draw on the graph what the right ventricular pressure would look like. Okay, now remember, everything happens at the same time. Whatever's happening on the left side of the heart is happening on the right side of the heart. So the timings are identical. You've only been asked to draw the right ventricle. Does it make sense that it would follow exactly the same line here, and it would go up and it would come down in exactly the same timings, but the pressure exerted, the pressure in the right ventricle would be always lower than the left ventricle. So if you drew a line something like that, you'd get the marks. Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you, Neve. Thank you, Neve, for your encouragement. I appreciate that. And finally, as a little kind of, let's end on a little high. What is it that makes those heartbeat sounds when you hear somebody's heartbeat? It's not the walls of the heart, it's not the ventricles contracting. You'd kind of think it must be the sound of the ventricles contracting. It's actually the sound of the valves closing. So the first beat of the heart that you hear, when you hear that kind of, and it's called lub-dub, 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 weird, I don't know why. I don't know why they go and call it badoom, badoom, or something like that. Anyway, lub-dub. This is the first heart sound here. If you had a little graph of heart sounds, this would be the first heart sound, and this would be, oh, sorry, I'm being really silly. That was, oh, no, wrong. Let's go back. Right. This would be the, just realized I've made an error. Let's take that out. Let's do this again. Let's now do it properly. And this, so this would be the first heart sound, and the semilunar valve closing, this would be the second heart sound. So when you hear somebody's heartbeat, the first sound you're hearing, and particularly you're hearing their left atrioventricular valve closing, because it's the one that's closing, it's snapping shut so suddenly under the greatest pressure. So you're hearing predominantly the left atrioventricular valve closing, and then the aortic semilunar valve closing. I just think that's quite cute. I hope that makes sense, and it's made sense of the graphs and made sense of the cardiac cycle as a whole. So now I'm going to go to any questions video, and I'm going to quickly do a summary while you can type in any questions that you have. But let me see if I can answer any others. Carwin, oh yes, I remember the blood going through the valves, and they're opening and closing, letting the blood through. Absolutely. Yeah, those semilunar valves have to open to let the blood out, and those atrioventricular valves have to open to let that blood down into the ventricles. So I'm hoping that the cardiac cycle now makes more sense, because you understand the principles that underline this whole topic. Hopefully you've understood the orientation of the valves and the fact that they open and close depending upon the relative pressure either side of those valves. And that pressure is exerted as a direct result of the walls of the chambers of the heart contracting. And you're just kind of understanding that the atrial walls are pathetically thin because they've only got to contract to produce enough force to push the blood down into the ventricles. The right ventricle is thicker because it has to contract to produce enough force to get the blood to the lungs. The left ventricle, by far the thickest wall, because it has to contract with enough force to get the blood around the whole body. Hopefully that makes sense. And then we went through the 3-stage cardiac cycle, cardiac diastole, when the whole heart is in relaxed mode, atrial systole, and ventricular diastole, when the atria contract and the ventricles are relaxed, filling up the atria, and then atrial systole and ventricular systole and atrial diastole, when the ventricles contract to whoosh the blood out of the arteries at the top of the heart. And hopefully that graph also made a little bit more sense. And kind of, I hope that you might do what I do and not learn it, understand it, and you can work it out in seconds if you kind of have the orientation and you understand orientation of the valves and you understand about the relative pressures. You can then work out pretty much anything from any application question because you know what you're looking for. You know the information that you're looking for. What causes turbulence over the valves? Oh my goodness, if only I was a heart surgeon. Sadly, I'm not. So the turbulence around the valves will absolutely be because of the so let's talk atrioventricular valves. There is massive turbulence in these valve pockets, and that will be because as the ventricle is contracting, without any doubt. If you think about it, when the valve is open, there's going to be precious little turbulence, yes, as the blood comes in, but I would imagine by far the greatest turbulence is as the valves are forced shut, because you've got that blood circulating around those concave areas of the valve. Hopefully that makes sense. I wish I could answer you more fully, but I'm not a cardiac specialist. Hopefully that's all right. And I hope that has clarified that topic for you and been helpful. Next week, it does look like I am doing evidence for translocation. So I'll probably very quickly, I've already done a live stream on translocation, and I've got a video on my website. And I will be talking about the evidence that proves some of our ideas about how translocation happens. That's what I'm going to be talking about next week. And I think it is particular between AQA and OCRA. It is particular to AQA. OCRA don't need to know it. And I'm going to have to check other exam boards to know. And if you are another exam board, do check that yourself. But I hope that's been helpful. And I will see you next Tuesday for a little bit of mass transport implants, a little bit of translocation. So I will see you then. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next week. All the very best. Oh, by the end of next week, we might actually know what is happening about exams. Woo-hoo. And on that very happy note, or maybe not, I will love you and leave you. See you next week. Bye-bye.